but I moved to Boston in 1972 from the New York area. I had gone to Parsons School of Design for one semester in graphic design because they didn't have fine arts back then at that school. And I couldn't afford to go to college, so art school was the next best alternative for me. So I started painting actually in New York City because I was living in a loft back when you could get one for like $300 a month. And so I started painting there. I came up to Boston and I had this really naive idea that I could work part-time and support myself and be an artist full-time and paint. And I discovered very quickly that that was irrational. So I started looking around for a job, and I happened to find a job working in the home of a woman who turned out to have a world-class antique doll collection. And some of these dolls were worth like $35,000, $40,000. And they were so intricate and so beautiful, and silks and satins and all the kinds of things that I loved coming up as a child when I was sewing next to my mom. So I thought, you know, maybe I could do that myself. So I started with little needle sculpture dolls, and they're down that aisle right there, just with a hunk of fabric and pulling in the eyes and the mouth with stitches and making them more realistic. And I don't know if you noticed the outfits, but everything was handmade, hand-tucked, organdy, you know, the finest fabrics and so on. And I started selling them for $25, and I couldn't make enough of them across the country. And when I finished selling them, they were selling for $150. Each one was totally individual, made from scratch by me, and every nationality, every part of the world was represented. And they were a big success, but I was getting bored, which I do very easily. So I wanted to work in cloth, but do something like a painting in round, like a portrait in round. So I started figuring out, how can I make hard-faced cloth dolls that look real? And at that time, I met a woman who was a writer, and she decided to do a book about me and my process. And I did a portrait doll of my son at age 6, and that's right over there in the center there with the book. And that was sold through Scribner's, and actually the book became a collector's item among doll people. And you may not know this, but collecting dolls was the biggest hobby in America in the 80s and 90s, bigger than coin collecting and stamp collecting. So it was, I happened to do all of this in its heyday, and it was wonderful. It made a life for me because I only had a high school education. I had a son to raise, and I needed something to stay the course, something to pay the bills. So anyway, it was wonderful. Then I started designing teddy bears the same way, and Sears picked up one of my teddy bears internationally, and that paid for the deposit on my first house. So it was very, very successful. I did a whole line of teddies. I was known for that. I was known internationally for my dolls. EJ and I used to do toy fair every year, and my husband EJ We used to do toy fair at the Javits Center every year, and I would collect orders and then work for 6 months on filling the orders, and then later I would have to design new work for the coming year. So it was kind of like a 6-month thing. When I started out, I was doing individual one-of-a-kinds, and I continued that through my whole career. But then I also needed to be able to find a way to make more of a living of it, and so I started doing limited editions of 12. And that'll become important when I tell you what happened afterward. But anyway, so I continued to do that, and toy companies decided, oh, all of these artists are having this big success with this very individualized look as opposed to what was in the mainstream in toys at that point. So they started hiring us as independent contractors. And we were artists. I mean, we were living hand to mouth. Is the check in the mail to pay the rent this month? And so when they offered us the big bucks, we went for it big time. But the problem was we were shooting ourselves in the foot because we thought, oh, what we did was so individual, and it was. They looked very different from the dolls that were in the mainstream. But then where I was producing an edition, say, of 12, they would go in and they'd produce an edition, made in China of like 100 or 1,500 of this version, and then in a blonde version, and then in a redhead version, and then a different costume, and so on. So that devalued the dolls so much that eventually it became so costly to develop a new design, even if we knew that it was going to be bought by a big company. It just didn't pay anymore. So right at that time, EJ and I decided to move to California because he got transferred. And I moved my whole doll business, excuse me, out to California, thinking, oh, this is my life. At this point, I had been in it for 25 years. And, excuse me, and I thought, well, I'm going to continue with that. But then I looked up from my work table and I looked around at the landscape out here, and that was like my poison. So we both decided to go back to school at the same time. EJ went back and got his economics degree, and I decided to go to college at age 68. And I did a 5-year program in 3 years, and got my BFA, and decided to work mainly in mixed media and plein air. So is there anyone here who doesn't know what plein air is? It's outdoor painting. Oh yeah, right. Poor guy, he has to live with this. But anyway, so I lived close to Monterey Bay, so I did most of my plein air painting there. But also during that time, I got very, very interested in mixed media because I had been working with materials since I was 9 years old. I learned how to sew at Mom's knee at age 9, and I was better than she was at age 12. So, mainly because I knew to follow the instructions, which she always thought she knew so much that she didn't have to follow, and she'd spend all her time ripping out. And anyway, so it was just very familiar for me to just collect stuff, fabrics, ribbons, leaves, twigs, anything that I could find that was of the least little bit interest. And because I got very interested in gold leaf and the use of gold and silver and the way it changes the light of a room, how it sends light all over the room. I started coating many of these materials in gold leaf, real gold leaf, by the way, and which was kind of expensive, but it was all very, very experimental. I was doing things like taking linen, for example, out on the sidewalk in front of my house with a pack of matches and burning it. And trying to get a certain look of the burn marks on it and the discoloration and so on. And I finally figured out it must have like a fire inhibitor embedded in the fabric, because I was having the worst time trying to do it. But I had paintings where I actually took bits and pieces of burned fabric and applied them to because it went with whatever the theme of the painting was. So that's how I started with the mixed media. But then I very quickly evolved. As soon as I taught myself how to do Photoshop, because I wanted to work in layers, and I wanted to make the process a shorter process so that I could actualize, so I could have a drawing or the equivalent of a drawing, and then I would go from there with the materials. So I would do things like take photographs of paintings I had done, or I would hire a model and work with the model for a year or two with specific poses that I wanted her to take. Mostly poses like from Renaissance paintings and things like that, or symbolic poses. And I would go outside and I would take photographs of light trails and shadows, like the shadows on this table. And then I would do a transparency in Photoshop and layer and layer and layer till I got sometimes 10 or 20 different layers. And then I had my drawing. And then I could begin. You know, at that point, all right, because I know that once I start working with the materials, it's going to evolve into something totally different. You can't reproduce something that you sort of saw online, but you can develop your idea as you're going along and figure out, okay, how am I gonna do this? You know, you have to have some kind of a plot plan to get from point A to point, I don't know, maybe B, and then you have to get to Z. So, you know, once you start working with the materials, it takes on a life of its own, and it becomes very, very different. And I did things like taking iridescent pigments and suspending them in acrylic gels, and then manipulating them with palette knives and so on. So you'll see some of that in some of these pieces here. And just to get certain effects, but there isn't one of them, not one of them, that looks just like the so-called drawing that I wound up with when I was working in Photoshop. But it was a great jump-off point for me. So there's, let's see, there's, just to explain a little bit more and to use an example, there's a painting over there with a Asian figure with a kimono, and she's sort of sitting on a compass. But that painting is on a service that cost me, I think, $200. Okay, and I didn't want to waste it. So what I had done is I had this idea of taking my model and putting her, a beautiful portrait of her in that painting, and she was posed with her figure doing something or other. The painting was completely finished in oil, completely. And it was a beautiful portrait of her, incredibly accurate. And I got here to Santa Fe, and I looked at it, and I said, this cannot stand. It was not what I had intended, so I had to sand the whole thing down, get rid of the portrait, and start from scratch. And so that other painting in there on that surface, and I was able to save my $200 surface. So, and that one has gotten into some very good national shows. So it's you know, it's a process. A lot of people ask me, how do you work with gold and silver leaf? And I had a heck of a time trying to figure out, you know, what are the old master ways and how did they do it and so on. And it turns out shellac, just a very, very old material, is what allows you to do it. You can both attach, the gold is wafer thin, and you have to do it, you can't breathe because it will take flight, and it's too expensive to take flight. So, you know, you have to be really, really careful. You transfer the gold leaf just on the edge of a paintbrush over onto the surface, and then you burnish it, and then you can cover it actually with shellac, because shellac has a slightly, it's a transparent material, but it has a slightly gold cast to it. So actually I was able to use that sometimes to turn like a low carat gold, like a 12 karat gold, which reads as almost silver, but it has a little bit of a gold cast to it. I was able to work with that, and you'll see on some of the paintings that all these abstracted backgrounds that I've done were done working with transparent paints, shellac, overlays of real gold leaf. Most of them are real gold leaf. There's a few of them, especially in the later years, where I made a deal with the devil and said, this isn't fair to be spending that much money on gold leaf. So anyway, but that's how you do it, and I'm happy to teach any of you if you want to learn, because actually I think that it embellishes landscape paintings beautifully also. And I've done frames and so on. So I think that's about it. All that I wanted to say about the work. I hope that you enjoyed the show, and that you'll read all of the titles of the pieces, because that really is the key into what the meaning of some of the pieces actually have like a double entendre meaning to them. So I hope you enjoyed the show. Does anyone have any questions about specific? Yeah.
I'm assuming you've actually tried the acrylic gold to see if that could imitate or simulate.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
Although, one thing that I have done is I've taken gold pigment, gold that has been pigmentized, and suspended it in a gel and then painted over something to give it light that it wouldn't necessarily have had. But no, I tried gold and silver paint. I've got a studio full of stuff like that that didn't work. More of the materials that I have did not work than what I have that did. But it's a lot of fun trying all of these new things, all of these overlays. Yeah.
So how did you learn how to use the gold?
I taught myself, just the
Trial
same
and
way I
error.
taught myself sculpture, I taught myself all of that. The only thing was when I was in school, when I was in college, I did take 3 mixed media classes, and that's when I got interested in gold leaf, and I started with acrylics, which was so much easier. But some of these pieces, the one with the falling figure with her arm outstretched and then the clouds are over her arm, that starts at the top. It starts as an oil painting. And then it progresses as you go down through the body until it becomes a totally acrylic paint. Because I wanted the clouds to float over her arm. And the only way I could figure out to do that, because you can't put acrylics and acrylic gels and things of that sort over oil painting, is to transition, which isn't that easy because oils tend to be more opaque than acrylics. And to transition through the figure until I got to the acrylic. And then, you know, that's how I managed to sort of make those clouds and make that. And so it's always a problem. I mean, what is your intent? Where are you trying to go with the piece? And then having basically the world open to you of materials and saying, how can I make this work? What can I use to make this transition from oil into acrylic and make it work? And have it archival, because what we do has to last, at least until the dumpster comes. So, yeah.
When you work with that gold leaf, is there a certain carat strength that you like to work with based on the alloy mix or something?
Yeah, I prefer 22 to 24 karat because it's definitely more vibrant. It has property. It's also easier to work with. It's usually just a little bit more, a little thicker and a little bit has more body to it. But there are pieces in there that are 12 karat gold that work because I wanted a more silvery look. And but you have to, that's another thing, is discovering the right varnish that can go over both oil and acrylic. And Gamlin's really the only one that makes a varnish that can do that. But some of the paintings I had to varnish the acrylic, others the oil part, and so on, and then make it all go together and work.
Carole, you mentioned you were going to get to it later. You said you limited your dolls to 12, and then I guess then becoming more valuable later on.
Well, that was the thing. I mean, I could make, the one of the kinds brought enough money that I could pay the rent, I could pay the mortgage, but we wouldn't need that much. So I had to find a way to make multiples and make myself into a sort of mini factory. So I would do a sculpture of a hand and arm in a certain scale, because everything has to be to scale. And maybe I'd do one with a closed fist and another holding something and so on, left and right, and then I would do them in different sizes and so on, so that I could have, maybe I'd have an 8-inch doll, maybe I'd have a 12-inch doll, and maybe I'd have a 14-inch doll, all in 1 year, but each doll had to be different. And they often held little handmade teddy bears and things of that sort. When I got to California and decided I wanted to be a painter, I had to do something, because you guys, especially you artists, you know, you can't send that check back. when it comes in the mail, you're going to cash it, and you're going to be tempted to do the work that you did for 25 years that is so easy to do. And so what I did is I went out in my garage one day and I destroyed about 100 RTV silicone molds of all of the arms and legs and heads and everything else that I had done. And it was sort of a discipline thing, because I knew I was entering school and I was going to become a painter, and I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to go backward. So I did one last doll for Marie Osmond, and that doll was introduced on QVC, and it sold out the night before. I didn't even get to see it on TV. And it sold out the night before, and that was my last doll project. So, yeah, I mean, I became a painter, which is what I had always wanted to be. So. Yes.
Canvas too?
Very rarely did I use iridescent paints. What you're probably seeing is iridescent, pigmentized iridescent paint in powder form, which I either sifted over gel in order to get a certain effect, and then allowed it to dry, or I manipulated it with a palette knife or whatever. That's how I worked, and that kind of thing went well with the silver or the gold leaf and helped integrate, because a lot of times something's very, very shiny, you're trying to transition to something a little more dull, and that was basically how I did it. Or sometimes I wanted to pick up the light with texture, and most of these paintings, I paint totally different, by the way. In my process in plein air is with a palette knife or a scraper, very freewheeling, transparent paints, and very, very direct. Whereas this is the total opposite way, of a very indirect way of reaching an end, of expressing a theme. Two sides. I guess I'm two sides of the coin. Yes.
I hope this question makes sense, but because you're talking about reaching an end and getting to a place, and for those of us who aren't artists, we kind of think of what's the picture going to look like. But for you guys, it's different, and there's a process, and you're going in a direction, but you're not sure. Can you talk a little about that? What are you? What's the...
We call it the happy accident. And it's true in plein air painting, in very direct painting, and also equally so in indirect painting.
Okay.
Because you have a concept that you're trying to actualize, but you may not fully have it in your mind visually where you want it to go.
Yeah.
And you, when you're a mixed media artist, you honor the medium.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm. You guys are always talking about. I get it a lot too.
Right. And that's why I had Diane print out that description of that one piece of how I developed that piece, which just came out of a broken printer experiment. And I didn't know what to do with it, but I wasn't going to throw out that paper. I'm sorry, BFK paper was expensive. So I just ripped it in half, and I said, oh, these two pieces, that's interesting. That looks like a line of demarcation of something. Before I knew it, I had this whole developed piece, and it worked.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
So that's how I work, and I try to stay open-ended so that those happy accidents will happen.
Yeah. As you go along.
Yeah, and just go with it. So, any other questions? No? Oh, come on. Well, thank you so much for showing up, and I hope that you'll stay a while and look at the paintings more, and maybe now you'll be able to see the differences from doll to doll too, because I mean, you look at dolls and you think, that's a doll. But if you look at their faces, I always based almost every single doll that I did, even the ones that I did commercially, on a specific child in my life. So you can see that. And also, since I was designing for toy companies and all, I brought some of that information here. You guys can look through and take a look at some of the projects that I've done. And also, I brought some, here. These are pictures of projects for toy companies, but also one-of-a-kind paintings. Please don't make off with these are the only ones I have. But they're interesting. Like, for example, at one point, they had me doing a collection called Real Models. And I had to do portraits of people like, famous models from that time, most of whom I forgot. Iman is here on the corner, and so on. And this is how I went blind, because the nostrils you couldn't see. You know, everything was done in wax, and then sent to Asia to be cast in whatever the final medium was going to be. And I became a master wax worker. I was one of the only artists who did original work, but then carried it through from beginning to end through all the stages to wax ready. Because when you sent it off to China, if you made a mistake, they reproduced that mistake. So since I was doing child dolls, that they had to be perfect, literally perfect. So that was, I thought I was going to actually be a rich woman someday, because I thought, I have a skill now suddenly. I don't need a degree. I have a skill. I can work wax. Well, then they got into it in China, and they start these kids off at age 12 or something, and they're master wax workers by the time they're 15. So I was out of a job. Anyway, that's life. So come and take a look, and take a look at the dolls again and the paintings in the light of what I've said, and see if you can pick out certain techniques that you might be interested in as artists. I'm happy to share. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you.